I told people I went for the lights. I lied. The chandeliers were honest with themselves, crystal tears spilling into the ballroom like a small determined rain, and everyone around me performed the weather as if it were a favor. I had grown up attending these evenings, my name folded into programs, my face catalogued in columns the way my mother catalogued her guests and their gifts. There is a particular currency to being seen in the right rooms, an economy of glances and embroidered introductions. People measure you by where you stand beneath the chandeliers, and how quickly you recollect the right names. I had learned the math early. I learned how to convert visibility into influence, influence into protection, protection into silence. But silk and light do not make a house a harbor. They make it a stage. She had everything, at least on paper. Name recognition, a ledger of philanthropic promises, a summer house with air conditioning in 3 zip codes, a roster of domestic staff who could find lost cufflinks with more alacrity than most people find their own keys. There was a limousine driver who knew my coffee order by heart. There were the pageant photographs, the charity boards, the columns that used to describe me as the inheritor of civic grace. Yet in the small hours, when the city thinned into noise you could hold in one hand, I realized the thing I wanted most was not another engagement announcement or a better PR team. I wanted a margin, quiet, measurable, auditable, the kind of space you create when you set a brass key down and mean it. Dante Moretti understood currencies that weren't printed on paper. He understood what visibility could buy and what it could erase. People called him a fixer before they called him a friend, someone who negotiated doors closed and backgrounds whitewashed, who could arrange that a delicate error in judgment be reframed as a misstep in judgment. He wore collared shirts as if they were arguments, neat, persuasive. He had guarded me on and off for 10 years. He had chauffeured me home from other candescent gatherings, explained away the press with a phrase and a look so precise it functioned as erasure. He arrived at my table with a brass key cupped in one hand, like an offering in a church. "This is for the house," he said. "For you. No one else gets in. We agree. I do not enter without a call. You have complete custody of the key, and I will provide logs of any movement. You can revoke access at any time." He spoke in contracts. He had the look of someone who liked to make things codified, tidy, and yet there was a familiarity to his gestures that had felt protective for years. When he offered the key, there was a small murmur among the women at our table, a sound like a napkin unfolding. In that moment, I thought of how often I had been offered protection that asked for nothing in writing. I had accepted then, because I believed in the grammar of debts, his protection, my silence. But time teaches you to read margins. I accepted Dante's terms. We negotiated 3 points aloud, and then I instructed Rosa to draft a log. Rosa had been the house manager long enough to know not to look astonished when aristocratic rituals met practical necessities. She carried herself with the kind of domestic competence that made whoever was on the other end of a phone feel better about their lives. She oversaw the pantry, the linens, the staff schedules, and in this, she was the first to notice that domestic order is never neutral. It is an architecture of care. The brass key was ceremonially placed in a small dish on the sideboard. Harini, whom I had insisted be contracted as technical custodian, received the duplicates. Harini is not dramatic about anything. She prefers folders with names and file sizes, and a margin note that reads like an inventory of intention. She had been an archivist at a university press before she told me she'd rather keep people's lives as data, rather than as ephemeral memory. She understood the metaphors I liked, ledgers for lives, greenhouses for refuge, and she matched them with instruments that could survive subpoenas and storms. She brought with her an air-gapped drive, a sleeping thing that sat off the network like a vault. She spoke in precise small sentences about checksums and metadata. When she explained how we would preserve evidence if needed, she did not condense it into heroics. She drew diagrams in the margins of my notebook, filigreed with dates and hash values, then wrote, "Chain of custody. Harini. Air-gapped. Rosa. Physical. Duplicate to encrypted cloud. Sealed. Time-stamped." It comforted me to see custody written as if it were a religious observance. We had rituals. We watered the greenhouse plant I named Margin at dawn because plants are honest. They mark the passage of time in growth rings and damp soil. The ritual was small, but recursive. A porcelain watering can, the same measured 2 fingers of water. The ledger entry. Margin. Watered, 0715. Soil moisture, 23%. These moments were my liturgy. If rituals could build boundaries, then the greenhouse, with its tempered glass and steady heat, was the chapel where I rehearsed being sovereign over my own life. Marco, the sentinel, circled the property like a patient sentence. He knew the pipes, the particular rattlings that meant the dishwasher had misbehaved or a branch had finally conceded to the wind. He kept a log of his own, times and plate numbers, and the glances of passers-by. He had a way of standing near windows that both dissuaded and surveilled. I suppose some people think of security as a physical thing, a camera, a lock. Marco treated it like an attentional ethic. Ross was the practical counterpoint to my literary inclinations. He ate sandwiches at his desk and could convert fear into forms with the flip of a pen. He spoke in conditional verbs and procedure, which is to say, he spoke in comfort. When he outlined the DA intake process, he did so the way a conductor explains timing. We file preservation requests, we collect logs, we prepare affidavits. The DA needs probable cause, pattern, or corroboration. He never promised a verdict. He offered steps. We called what we did Refuge Week. That phrase is not to romanticize. It is to index a practice. 1 week, limited access, explicit protocols. The brass key sat in its dish. Harini kept the copy in a sealed envelope with a time-stamped log. Dante would have cardinal access only if he requested it and I approved. All movements would be logged. If privacy is a commodity, then in Refuge Week we bought a small allotment of it, and we purchased it with contracts. The first 3 days felt like a miracle that arrives from modest bureaucratic rigor. The house exhaled. I read in the greenhouse under a lamp that made the leaves glow with improbable emeralds. I drank tea that Rosa insisted was the sort that held attention steady. We kept ledgers like prayer. There was a utility in not answering every ring of the phone, a deliberate scarcity of being reachable. My phone, usually a hot center of requests, cooled. I wrote in the margins of my own life, appointments canceled, a notation of a book returned, lines that would, later, act as timestamps. On the 4th night, at 02:13, an alert pinged on Harini's console. She sat on the sofa because she does not do drama standing up. Her voice, when she said it, was small and precise. Someone initiated a viewport, she said. The words sounded like something from a distant jurisdiction of law I had only visited in passing. Viewport, an authorized remote access through providers who offer security camera feeds and smart locks as service. Most of the time, viewport is a technical term that translates to someone looked in. The mechanics of it were mundane and exact. An IP address, a set of session tokens, a duration of connectedness. Harini showed me the log. Oro 213 to Zo 217, an IP routed through a reputation firm Dante had once recommended. The session had accessed the greenhouse camera and a hallway cam focused on the dining room. The metadata showed a request that had the hallmarks of the vendor's dashboard interface, the same dashboard we used when Rosa needed to reset a camera or when Marco needed to check a feed during a suspicious package report. I looked at the brass key in the dish. I asked a normal question. Did anyone authorize it? Harini's face made a small, sensible decline. There is no record in the ledger. The request did not come from one of the user credentials we provisioned. The session token is ephemeral but traceable to a vendor account that doesn't match the household administration. There is an access log that suggests a human clicked. There is agency. We did not leap. I had been schooled in the art of not leaping. I am, by habit and training and the endless polishing of my manner, someone who waits until the ledger balances. But the house had been quiet, in a way that made silence feel aggressive. To be watched in a place you had designed for privacy felt different from a theft of property. It felt like a theft of the architecture you had worked to build. Dante arrived 10 minutes later with 2 coffees and the apologetic smile of someone who wanted to model calm. He had been out driving a client, he said. His shoes were scuffed in the way of someone who had not paused to think about humidity. He kept his hands out of his pockets. I initiated a viewport, he said. You wanted me to check the perimeters because of that article last month. I thought. He paused in the way men do when they want to leave room for a motive that will not entirely exonerate them. I thought the dashboard might show whether the property had been probed. I did not archive or copy anything. The sentence was a variant of two things: the reason of a protector and an evasion. I remember looking at him and thinking of how often protection and possession share clothes. Dante's explanation may have been practical, and in some sense reasonable. He had, after all, been granted a form of trust on previous occasions. The problem for me was procedural and ethical. Consent is not a momentary permission. It is a revocable, recorded act, something you sign into the ledger. He had not called. He had not requested. He had acted. That breach, small in time but enormous in the architecture of trust, was now a record. "I asked you not to," I said. The words were quieter than I might have expected. "I asked for logs. I asked for the key to be a symbol we both respected." Dante folded his hands. "You told me it was for emergencies. This seemed like an emergency. There are emergencies that are obvious and emergencies that are rhetorical. I could have let the matter rest there, as some women in my circle often did. A private conversation, a handshake, a donation made in the other's name, and then a collective smoothing over. That path is seductive because it preserves appearances. It preserves the shine of the chandelier. Instead, I asked Harini to preserve everything. She did not hesitate. She photographed logs, captured session snapshots, extracted the IP headers and the vendor's session tokens. Harini pulled the air-gapped drive toward her like something sacred. She made a duplicate, then another, sealing copies in envelopes stamped with the time. She wrote down exactly how she transferred the files, and on the ledger column she added her name under chain of custody. Even as she worked, her calmness was its own kind of sermon. The notion that data, once properly preserved, could be the architecture upon which one built a case. Ross arrived mid-morning, wiping sleep from his eyes, and reminding me, by the tilt of his head and the small notebook he always kept under his elbow, that institutions do not move at the speed of righteous clarity. "We can request preservation orders from platforms," he said. "We can file for subpoenas if we need vendor invoices. But remember, the DA needs more than a single session. They need pattern or corroboration, or something that suggests intent rather than curiosity. I find it useful to write down the thing I mean in the ledger as if words can be made to be physical." I wrote, "Breach, viewport, 02, 13, 02, 17. Greenhouse plus dining cam, session token traces to vendor account X, no ledger authorization. Dante admitted access. Harini preserved copies." The page felt heavy, but the act of inscription transformed chaos into a line item that could be budgeted. There are two ways to respond to a betrayal that violates the terms of a refuge. You can either render it personal and combustible, or you can convert it into a procedural question. I promised myself I would not be consumed by the former. The latter allowed me to act, and action in my lexicon is less a public performance than a means of securing margin for others. I asked Harini to run lookbacks. "Search for other unauthorized viewports," I said. "Check for copies. Cross-reference vendor accounts. See if there are invoices to those accounts that match access times." She spent the afternoon with screens that made the room look like the inside of a chest full of maps. She talked quietly about checksums the way a priest talks about scripture, with reverence. "When we compute a hash on the file, it gives us a fingerprint. If a vendor claims they do not have copies, we can show them the fingerprint. If someone tries to alter the file, the hash will change. If we store an untouched drive off-network and seal it with a timestamp, that record becomes a witness." Witness. I liked the word. Witness was a material thing now. An air-gapped drive, a stamped envelope, Rosa's signature below the notation. The domestic apparatus had become a legal one. The greenhouse had been transformed in 4 days into an evidence room. Rosa's small acts were important. She walked me through the house and through gestures of domestic custody. The dishes that belonged to the brass keys dish, the precise labeling of drawers, the placement of the spare in a sealed envelope inside a locked safe. "If we have to hand things to another person," she said, adjusting a porcelain plate, "we do so with the receipts. No surprises. When we put receipts and timestamps in a line, they turn suspicion into a story the state can read." I had learned that the machines of law are legible but slow. They require habit and documentation, the kind of patient fidelity that grates against the faster currents of gossip and rumor. In my circles, one could buy silence with a check. Not everyone has that option. Not everyone has a Harini. 2 days after the viewport, an envelope arrived at the house. The return address was blank. Inside was a photograph of the greenhouse taken through its glass, at a slant that suggested someone on the outside, and a single note folded in half. On the note was a word. Noted. I placed the photograph on the ledger and felt something in my chest unclench in a way that seemed fatalistic. The photograph was not pornographic, nor was it intimate in the ways some damaging images are. It was instead a confirmation of exposure. It was surveillance-made material. Someone had turned, looking into a product, and sold it to someone else. Or at least sent it as a message. The word noted read like invitation and admonition simultaneously. Dante said he had nothing to do with the envelope. He looked tired, in the way of someone who sleeps in the wrong time zone. I will cooperate, he said. If this is a mistake, I will find who did it. If it was a vendor, I will make them refund any unauthorized access. If I step beyond what was agreed, then I will accept oversight and make reparations. His language was legalistic and personal. He spoke the way someone who understood both the transactional and the sentimental registers does. There was a sincerity that felt exact. Nevertheless, the ledger doesn't care for sincerity. The ledger cares for names, dates, and hashes. Will you sign a written acknowledgement of the breach and allow an independent audit? I asked. He hesitated. For someone good at moving doors shut, hesitation is an anomaly. It's the gap where power concedes to consequence. Yes, he said. He signed. The signature held his hand to the page in a way that meant something materially different from words. It was a crisp, public thing. We agreed on oversight. We asked a vendor that specialized in security audits to evaluate the account. We asked Harini to render everything immutable. We prepared copies of the photograph for the ledger, but kept the images off the public network. There is an economy of preservation. You keep copies close because circulation is what makes privacy a marketable thing. At this point, some people in my life urged quiet. Old friends counseled forbearance. An aunt suggested a donation to a criminal justice fund under their joint names. They proposed that we smooth without making a spectacle. I respect smoothing. I have smooth hands. But I also know that smoothing for the person with money is a privilege denied to many without it. If Dante's breach is a violation for me, it may be catastrophic for someone with fewer resources. The envelope that came anonymously could have been accompanied by a takedown invoice. People with less money do not get the benefit of ritualized restoration. I thought about Ela. She was introduced to me by a mutual volunteer at a shelter. A small woman who runs a micro-business and keeps her receipts in a shoebox. Ela's harm was not mine, and yet it became mine in the shared sense that our civic life is entangled. She could not afford the vendor fees that scrubbed her images from a forum. She could not buy the preservation help that made evidence durable. One image circulated. It cost her a small, literal fortune in reputational damage. Her situation was not mine, but it was a mirror. The mirror is often the most exact teacher. That is when I began to think institutionally, not in terms of how to restore myself, but in terms of how to convert the resources at my disposal into a mechanism that could serve others. I have money. I have visibility. I have a ledger that people read. I decided that I would not use those things to return us both to a version of private balm. I would turn them into architecture. But architecture requires foundations. It requires governance and audits and survivor advisory structures that avert the temptation to make privacy a bespoke luxury. For now, the immediate problem remained: the breach. Harini had done her work. The copies were sealed, the checksums recorded. Ross wanted to draft preservation requests to the platforms that might hold ancillary copies. We ask the platforms to preserve logs for 90 days, he said. We request vendor invoices, and if they resist, we subpoena. We put in preservation requests to make sure nothing is deleted until we decide our next move. He spoke of subpoenas with the same clarity he reserved for the weather. Subpoenas demand records, he said. They are not judgments. They are an invitation for institutions to hand over their files. Preservation orders prevent deletion while we decide whether to make that demand. Then the DA reviews. The DA wants probable cause and often corroboration. This is the slow music of law. It is music that does not always answer the moral tone immediately. It measures things in days and metadata, and the readiness of a prosecutor to stand by you. People with money can afford to wait while the music sweeps through its measures. People without money get swept along or left behind. That asymmetry bothered me more than the violation itself. We filed preservation requests that afternoon. Harini sent the duplicates to a secure vault in a jurisdiction with a clear record of enforcing data integrity. She created a new column in the ledger and wrote, "Preservation orders written, 07-10. Platforms A, B, C. Vendor invoices requested." Marco printed out the paper copies and placed them in a folder. The practicalities of physical paperwork felt like a kind of prayer in the modern world. When Lena called, she was cautious. Lena is a journalist who understands the ethics of framing. She had covered privacy and power before. She did not want a scandal. She wanted a story that could make policy move. "If you do this right," she said, "it could change how platforms think about preservation. They tend to default to ephemeral. You can force a record to be kept." I had not intended to go to the press. Visibility is a double-edged gift for my kind. It draws attention as much to the wrong as to the remedy. But Lena listened to the ledger and saw the scaffolding we were erecting. She spoke the way someone who knows how to shape public attention does, with the suggestion that narrative becomes leverage. If we converted a private wrong into a public institutional question, if we asked platforms to create preservation protocols under legal pressure, then what was a single breach might become a policy conversation. "Make sure there's consent to speak," she said. "We can anonymize clients. We can make the conversation not about you, but about systems. You have resources. Use them to build guardrails." I did not want my life to be the prop for a policy piece, but I wanted the policy. I thought of Ela again, the shoebox receipts. She needed a takedown and a preservation order she could not access. That alone justified something other than private smoothing. We kept moving through the ledger with an economy that allowed no theatrics, only procedure. Harini extracted vendor invoices, and what she found was not dramatic in a tabloid sense, but damning in the ways institutions can be. There were invoices that matched access windows. There were vendor relationships with reputation firms that boasted about reducing public visibility for a fee. The invoices were not confessions. They were commerce. The market for exposure and suppression exists. Someone takes a photograph. Someone else packages it. Someone else sells its disappearance. Dante sat with the invoices like a man who watches a storm catalogued on paper. He offered to fund an independent audit. He asked for oversight. He signed forms agreeing to transparent accounting of any funds he would give toward remediation. He said he wanted to make things right in a manner that respected our agreed protocols. I accepted oversight. I wrote in the ledger, oversight, audit firm contracted, terms, no anonymous donations into oversight account, survivor advisory panel to be convened if foundation proceeds. Even at that early stage, the mind reaches outward. You cannot hold every wrong as a private bruise. If you have the means to convert your hurt into a tool that helps others, there is a moral temptation and a moral obligation. Perhaps both. If visibility has become monetized, then privacy must be defended by public instruments, not just by private checks and letters. Late that week, in a narrow moment between Harini sealing another drive and Rosa preparing a tray of tea, I sat with my ledger and thought about the two keys, Dante's brass key and the copy Harini had stored away. When you name a thing, when you set it on a dish and write its movements, you make a contract with your own memory. The dish was an altar of limits, the ledger, the liturgy. We did not have answers yet. The DA had not been involved. There was no indictment, no apology that restored. There was paper and timestamps and promises. What we had was action that could be read. We had made the first move from private harm to public record. That is where the work begins, not in an immediate vindication, but in creating the means for questions to be answered at all. The world makes privacy a luxury by default. If you cannot afford to preserve a file, you cannot afford to prove a wrong. If your evidence is deleted because you do not have counsel or an archivist, your harm evaporates into rumor. Perhaps this is why I began, in the days that followed, to think of a different ledger. One that did not belong to a single house or a single person, but to a structure that could offer preservation as a public good. My anger, if it could be called anger, was not wanton. It translated into architecture, an idea for a modest non-profit, a place where survivors could get emergency preservation, legal intake, temporary relocation assistance, and an advisory council of survivors to guide governance. If Dante's breach had revealed a market in exposure, then we would attempt to create a counter-market, a place where privacy could be purchased back not with cash, but with a right to be free from exploitation. The idea was not new in substance. There are other organizations that provide parts of such help. But the specificity of our model would be in its integration. Archives handled by professionals like Harini, legal intake that Ross could help to standardize, emergency housing that Rosa could manage, and selective public advocacy crafted with journalists like Lena, who would frame the problems as systemic rather than personal. I began drafting the Ledger's new column that night. I wrote, Foundation, Objectives, 1. Emergency Preservation, 2. Legal Intake Coordination, 3. Rapid Response Takedown Liaison, 4. Survivor Advisory Council, 5. Policy White Paper on Platform Preservation Obligations. I underlined Survivor Advisory Council. That underlining was not performative. It was a commitment against paternalism. There are people who will read these words and think I built this as a monument to my own grievance. That is a suspicion I have to welcome and answer in the architecture. Governance, audits, and donor restrictions that prevent the foundation from becoming a private instrument serving private ends. If you create structures in your own image, you will reproduce your own blind spots. We sought to guard against that in the Ledger the way Rosa guarded the China, counting, labeling, refusing to allow anonymous or unrestricted endowments that could be diverted. For now, however, the Ledger remained preoccupied with what was immediate. The viewport, the photograph with its single word, and the invoices that sketched a market. Harini continued to run checksums and maintain chain of custody. Ross drafted preservation request templates and explained the difference between preservation demands and subpoenas, as if I were reading a weather report. One asks for calm, the other requires clouds to produce rain. Dante agreed in writing to an independent audit and to hold any funds for remediation in an escrow that would be overseen by Rosa and an independent accountant. He gave his promises in the language of his trade. Promises in the Ledger are not enough, but they are a start. Late that night I watered Margin. The leaves were thick and clean in the greenhouse light. There is something about tending a plant that steadies a person who lives primarily in public eyes. I tilted the porcelain can, watched water pool in the soil, wrote, Margin, watered, 2302. Notes. Plant shows resilience. The plant's name is not an affectation. It was intended as an ethical reminder. Margins are not merely decorative. They are survival. I placed the brass key in the dish and then, somewhat absurdly, placed my palm over it. My skin touched old metal. The key had weight despite its smallness. It had been promised to keep me safe. It had been used without my consent. There are ways in which the truth of an object is that it remembers more than you intend it to. The scratches from previous owners, the tiny dent where it fell. Objects bear witness in a more patient register than people do. We had, through paperwork and timing and small rituals of stewardship, converted a private infraction into a recorded sequence with witnesses. That is the first labor of accountability, to make the wrong legible. When I closed the Ledger for the night, the house hummed with its own obligations. Water pumps in their steady thrum, the refrigerator making small mechanical apologies, the city lights slatting through the blinds. The photograph with the single word sat on the sideboard beneath the chandelier, an odd low luster in its own right. I did not know then whether the systems I intended to build would endure or would be compromised by the very markets they intended to regulate. I did not know whether Dante's contrition would be sufficient or cynical, whether vendors would cooperate or hide behind corporate shells. I woke the next morning with the Ledger's column open and an idea that had the force of a moral calculus: to turn my refusal to smooth into a program of collective redress. The first steps were pedestrian: draft preservation letters, negotiate audit terms, secure escrow on remediation funds. But they answered a larger demand: the conversion of private harm into a public question. Before I move beyond this week, let me place one practical note here, because some people will find a breach and not know the first step. I have put resources and links in the description for emergency preservation and survivor support. If this story feels like a mirror for you, or for someone you know, please consider looking there. We cannot fix structural asymmetry with a single ledger entry, but we can ensure that help is within reach for those who need it. That afternoon, Harini called me into her workspace. She had been cross-referencing vendor invoices with session tokens, and, she does not like to use dramatic phrasing, had found something that suggested this might not be an isolated curiosity. There are patterns, she said. There are other access points that correlate with vendor billing spikes across the region. They are not all you, but the market is there. We sat at the big table while she outlined clusters of activity. Patterns are the grammar of evidence. They do not speak in certainties, but they do point to systems. If the market for exposure exists as an industry, then what we faced was not just a person, but a network. Our small refuge week had, in a matter of days, become an investigation. I found myself, as ever, attentive to the way domestic acts and institutional ones intersected. The greenhouse, with margin steady in its soil, became an emblem. An insistence that peace is not absence of exposure but the presence of guardrails. We were, I realized, at the edge of something larger than an individual wrong. The ledger was less a record than a blueprint, for preservation, for advocacy, for a modest institution that could treat privacy not as an exclusive amenity, but as a right. The idea shimmered in the margins of my writing like the way the chandeliers had shimmered at the gala. Beautiful, slightly hazardous, requiring stewardship. I did not yet know how far I would be willing to take Dante, whether to prosecute, settle, or mediate. I did not yet know if the DA would take the case, or whether platforms would respond with policy changes. But I knew what I would do next. Preserve, document, and begin to build structural responses that did not rely on private smoothing. I closed the ledger and set the brass key beside the photograph with the single word. The key and the image were witnesses to a night that had altered our architecture of consent. The plants do not ask for retribution. They ask for water. The ledger does not seek vindication. It seeks an account. The dish holds the key, and I, the socialite's daughter, began to write the first lines of a foundation in the margin of my own life. The work would outlast any one of us. It would be messy and partial and painfully slow. At the edge of that work is a simple claim. Peace must be auditable. The rest of it, how the DA answers, whether Dante accepts constraints, whether vendors admit complicity, are chapters to be written into the ledger with witnesses and hashes. For now, we had preserved, we had documented, and we had decided that private wrongs would be refused, the gentle erasure of charity alone. We would attempt, through governance and ledger and advice, to build a margin large enough for people like Ella. The greenhouse light warmed my hands as I closed the ledger. The plant margin glowed in the night like a promise. The brass key sat cold in the dish. I left the porch light on, not because the world was kind, but because illumination costs nothing and has a way of revealing what arrangements we are willing to defend. The porch light hummed until dawn and then surrendered to a thin, tremulous morning. Rosa left a pot with chamomile by my bedside. She writes small notes on the back of receipts and tucks them like talismans into the ledger. Marco drove his rounds with the kind of attention that misreads nothing as incidental. Harini arrived with 2 sealed envelopes, and the kind of look an archivist affords to a manuscript that has a history it will not willingly forget. Ross had scheduled a meeting with the DA's intake team for mid-afternoon. Lena wanted to time a piece. The day unfolded as a series of calibrated acts. Calls, copies, signatures. The DA's office sits in a building whose architecture insists on gravity. It smells faintly of institutional coffee and the paper of things that were once urgent and have been legislated into procedure. The deputy assigned to our intake was practical, and not particularly theatrical. Someone who had done this work long enough to have a vocabulary of thresholds. She listened while Ross laid out the preservation steps we had already taken. Harini presented the air-gapped copies and recited checksums like a set of coordinates. I recited the ledger entries, measured and unembellished, dates, times, session tokens, the photograph marked noted, Dante's admission, the sealed copies. We can open an investigation, the deputy said. But you should have a sense of the calculus here. For criminal prosecution, we need to show that an access was unauthorized with an intent sufficient for the statutes we are considering. In many privacy-adjacent breaches, the line between curiosity and intent is not criminally bright. That said, preservation is valuable. If there are vendor invoices showing repeated, patterned sales of access, that changes the picture. I asked what pattern looked like in their terms, and she held up a hand the way someone shows a map. Multiple accesses to multiple victims. Invoices that show billing for monitoring or exposure services sold as a product. Corroboration that an individual or firm distributed images or did not comply with takedown requests. Also, vendor obfuscation. If a provider refuses to hand over logs or claims they have no records when hashes show copies exist, that can be a lever for further action. She did not promise charges. She did not promise closure. She did promise two things that mattered. She would accept the intake, and she would issue subpoenas where the investigation suggested them. The intake became, in our ledger's language, another line item. DA intake accepted 0715, Deputy K assigned, subpoenas drafted contingent on vendor responses. Subpoenas feel, in practice, like the most prosaic sort of threat. A court order served with the mechanical courtesy of a clerk. They ask platforms and vendors to hand over records. Session logs, invoices, internal dashboards. Preservation requests had already kept content from disappearing. Subpoenas compel institutions to produce the records for official scrutiny. When staff counsel for vendors responded, their first letters spoke in the calm, neutral voice of corporate defense. One representative wrote that their dashboards could show session summaries, but that logs were purged after a period outlined in their policy. Another claimed any access was normal operations or incidental to security scans. Harini and I spent long hours cross-referencing the vendor invoices she'd unearthed with session tokens and IP trails. Where tokens matched a vendor account, their invoices sometimes told a different story. Line items for media removal or visibility mitigation, adjacent to bland entries labeled research. In a few cases, invoices indicated a pattern of billing spikes aligning with accesses across a cluster of properties in the same neighborhood. The pattern suggested a marketplace. Photographs or feeds were aggregated, repackaged, and then sold under the rubric of reputation management or security. Lena's piece ran with careful restraint, a long-form investigation that centered systemic failures and put institutions, platforms, vendors, law enforcement, at the heart of the frame rather than the spectacle of a named person's grief. She anonymized the victims she could. She used our ledger and the DA intake as scaffolding for her argument that preservation had become a technical problem with moral consequences. The headline read, in a measured voice, that the market in exposure treats visibility as inventory and privacy as a commodity. Public attention, when it comes to people like me, is elastic. It stretches to encompass a scandal and then shrinks to leave space for other things. But Lena's reporting focused on the structural. The ease with which footage could be routed through dashboards, the opacity in billing, the casual conflation of monitoring with product. Her piece put pressure on vendors to respond publicly, which is to say it created a new ledger of reputational risk. For platforms, that pressure translated into conversations in legal departments. For vendors, it translated sometimes into urgent calls to sales teams and, occasionally, to counsel. The vendors push back the way industries do, with policy citations, buttons labeled, "We comply," and the occasional evasive sentence. Our terms of service are clear, one counsel wrote. Any access would be authorized by contractual agreement with the account holder. You may be able to identify an IP trace, but correlation does not equal custody of the end product. These were not dishonest sentences necessarily. They were statutory hedges that rely on the general public's unfamiliarity with the architecture of logs and tokens. Harini, who prefers the company of file headers to press releases, smiled a small archival smile and said, "Correlation does not mean causation, but it does make a story legible. If you can show transactions that correspond to access and downward payments to reputation firms, that's more than correlation. That's commerce. Commerce is governed by invoices." The idea that business records were the key was one Ross repeated in 1,000 slightly different ways. "Follow the invoices," he said. "They are the ledger of motive." Meanwhile, within the house, the private negotiations continued with a fatigue peculiar to prolonged intimacy. Dante consented to an independent audit, overseen by a firm whose name I will not anthologize, because the firm matters less than the measure. Independence, published methodology, and a firewall against anonymous donations. He signed an agreement to place funds into an escrow controlled by Rosa and an independent trustee, and he allowed the auditors access to his devices under specified constraints. He also insisted, with a steadier hand than his words sometimes showed, that he had acted out of habit and a desire to prevent harm when he had initiated the viewport. The auditor's initial report was careful, forensic, and, in the ledger's terms, not definitive of criminal intent. They found that Dante had initiated the session, and that vendor dashboards made it technically straightforward to look in. They did not find a verified copy of files on Dante's devices, but they did find metadata indicating an account under his control had logged in, and that, in several instances, vendor invoices suggested consumption of monitoring services for properties connected to high-profile individuals. Their language was precise: evidence of access, evidence of provision, evidence of a market, evidence of willful distribution, not established. The auditors recommended oversight and remediation, and suggested that the foundation we were incubating be part of a compliance pilot, a demand-side mechanism to ensure that vendors maintain deletion logs and that platforms can respond to preservation requests in a standardized way. Dante's cooperation, however incomplete in moral terms, was operationally useful. He agreed to fund the pilot under conditions that prevented him from steering funds anonymously. He accepted the inclusion of an external survivor advisory council to oversee the fund's disbursement for private takedowns and preservation grants. He also accepted, with a look that suggested calculation and something like contrition, that his name might be attached to remediation in ways he could not fully control. The ledger recorded his promises, and more important, recorded the mechanisms designed to prevent their capture. The project of converting personal resources into a public instrument required 1,000 small acts of legal and ethical engineering. We incorporated a non-profit with a name that was practical and not theatrical. Margins, a modest term meant to signify a right rather than an affectation. The articles were drafted in Ross's careful conditional verbs. Purpose: to provide emergency preservation, legal intake coordination, rapid takedown liaisons, temporary relocation, and policy advocacy. The governance documents contained clauses I insisted upon: independent auditors, survivor majority advisory panels, donor restrictions prohibiting anonymous giving that could be used to influence intake decisions, and a firewall between remediation funds and general operating funds. Recruiting the Survivor Advisory Council was the part that required the most humility and the least PR. We invited people whose names would not make headlines, but whose knowledge would make practices better. Ela, who had been the original mirror I had held up, was the first member to accept. Her voice in the early meetings was small, exact, and interpretive. She described procedures in the language of consequence. How a takedown costs more than money. It costs the labor of chasing links, the energy to recruit counsel, the time to document what was happening. "You are writing something I could not have afforded," she told me once, looking at the ledger as though it were a map. "If you make a process I can follow, that matters." Ella's case was illustrative of asymmetry. Her images had been scraped and reposted by a forum that monetized attention. She could not afford prayerful counsel or the fees reputation firms charge. She received threats of extortion, a small local rumor that metastasized into work refusals and the quiet closing of doors to her micro-business. When Margins intervened, Harini executed preservation orders, cataloged session tokens, and sealed evidence. Ross drafted letters to platforms insisting on immediate takedown and offered pro bono counsel through a partnership with a small legal clinic. Lena agreed to hold Ella's identity unless Ella chose otherwise. In the weeks that followed, a coordinated takedown and a platform's temporary hold on content led to a limited remediation. Some pages went dark, invoices were exposed, and reputation firms' customer service teams were forced to respond to legal queries rather than simply bill. Not every outcome was decisive. One large platform delayed compliance, citing a volume of legal requests and a need for internal review. Another vendor produced a cache of contracts that, while embarrassing, fell within their terms of service. Some vendors rebranded their offerings with language that sounded less predatory, but functioned similarly. The DA continued its inquiry, issuing subpoenas to platforms and reputation firms. Some vendors produced invoices readily, others only after court compulsion. A handful of small vendors agreed to changes, disclosure about retention windows, and an explicit opt-in mechanism for any access that would count as viewing resident cameras beyond operational security checks. There were legal skirmishes. We filed civil preservation letters, then subpoenas, then, where appropriate, motions to compel production in the jurisdiction of a court that would subject the vendors to process. Platform counsel argued jurisdictional technicalities. Sales teams pleaded impossibility of retroactive policy shifts. In one instance, a vendor's counsel offered a settlement of modest funds on the condition of confidentiality. We refused confidentiality for evidence affecting a broader public interest. The decision irritated some donors who preferred expediency. It also, in the ledger's language, marked a commitment. Repair would not be privatized at the expense of public learning. The Foundation's white paper, drafted with Lena's editorial precision, Ross's legal clarity, Harini's archival attention, and input from survivors, laid out concrete prescriptions. It argued for three things, primarily. First, a standardized preservation protocol that platforms would be required to honor under a clear legal notice. Second, an obligation for vendors who provide monitoring services to publish retention and transfer logs and to require express, revocable consent for non-security access. Third, a publicly accessible registry for emergency preservation requests that would allow an independent auditor, such as an archivist like Harini, to certify compliance. The paper did not pretend that law could solve everything. It suggested a combination of statutory pressure, industry standards, and public accountability. The response to the paper was an uneven thing. One mid-sized platform announced a pilot program that would accept emergency preservation requests through a secure channel and hold content pending council review. It was a small victory, but a real one, codifying in practice what we had only asked be preserved administratively. A reputation firm's trade association convened a task force to consider transparency in invoices and retention windows. Some legislators reached out with curiosity. The DA's office took the subpoenas back to a grand jury for more careful review of vendor practices. The investigation broadened beyond the person who had looked at my greenhouse camera and into a network of services that trafficked in visibility. There was also the slow, domestic work of governance. We convened weekly meetings where the advisory council, mostly people who had no taste for publicity, discussed intake guidelines and ethics. We refused to build an intake process that demanded re-traumatization. We designed a triage that prioritized preservation and safety. We wrote policies stating that survivors would control the narrative of their own stories, and that intake fees would be underwritten by restricted funds. We hired a small case manager to coordinate takedowns, and to be the human who would not let systems reduce a person to an evidence packet. Not all donors appreciated these constraints. Some wanted rapid public victories. Others wanted named endowments. We declined anonymous, unrestricted gifts that would undermine the independence of intake. Donor restrictions are a piece of architecture as vital as an escrow. They protect the institution from being used as an instrument of influence masquerading as charity. The ledger grew with a column about donors. Names, restrictions, audit clauses. Rosa kept a separate physical file with paper receipts for every penny spent out of remediation funds. She would not allow the checks to be cashed without 2 signatures. Dante's relationship to the Foundation remained complex. He attended a governance meeting where he was allowed to listen but not to vote. He provided funds into the escrow with clear strings. His payment would be transparent, auditable, and subject to oversight by an independent accountant. He accepted, with some visible discomfort, that his remediation could not be a private purchase. It had to be public and accountable. In the ledger I wrote, with a hand steadier than the memory of his access, Dante. Remediation funds accepted 0803, oversight, independent accountant, audit to be published. There were moments of private exchange that felt like small moral settlements rather than absolutions. Once, in the greenhouse, Dante stood with me at the table where Margin had been given a new pot after a slight root rot. He apologized, not theatrically but plainly, and then asked a question that was not entirely tactical. "What would make this right to you?" he asked. I could have answered simply, criminal charge, social ruin, an apology front page enough to satisfy some measure of public restitution. Instead, I told him what the ledger demanded of me. Transparency, oversight, a mechanism that prevents what you did from being possible in the first place. I wanted him to understand that the currency I had inherited, visibility, connections, could do more than smooth my hurt. It could be used to rewrite the rules, He placed his hand on the brass key in the dish and did not reach to take it. "I'll accept oversight," he said. "Good," I said. "Then let the oversight be public." He nodded. It was not contrition with melodrama attached. It was a practical admission that certain privileges must be tethered. The DA's office, after months of methodical collection and cross-jurisdictional haggling, did not indict on criminal charges for me. The deputy explained, carefully, kindly, that the statutory thresholds for unauthorized access and distribution require a pattern that implicates both intent and harm, in ways that the current evidence could not, beyond reasonable doubt, support at the criminal level. Yet the subpoenas and the public reporting had produced something else. Civil inquiries into vendor practices, which led to a handful of firms agreeing to change retention windows and to publish deletion logs, and one small reputation firm entering into a consent agreement with a regulatory body to alter its terms and to implement an audit trail for access. These were modest wins. They were not the dramatic justice some hearings might stage. They were policy adjustments and transparency changes that made preservation and proof marginally more accessible for those without private ledgers. ELA's takedown was effective. A forum agreed to remove specific posts and to credit the preservation request as the reason for removal. The court fights we might have waged to force broader disclosures were expensive and uncertain. We used the Foundation's funds sparingly, focusing on strategic precedents and resources that could be pooled. The Foundation published its white paper with the Survivor Advisory Council's seal of approval. Lena wrote an op-ed tying the recommendations to concrete requests: preservation channels for emergency requests, vendor transparency, and an ethical registry for monitoring services. A handful of legislators introduced bills inspired by the paper. Incremental hearings were scheduled. One platform issued a pilot program. 2 vendors updated their invoices to be less opaque. Not enough? Certainly. Meaningful? Also. At night, the house resumed its rituals. The brass key sat in the dish with the second key Harini had sealed away. One for access, one for custody. I made an entry in the ledger. Keys. Dish. Present. Protocol. 2 key custody. Harini backup. Rosa safe. The ledger, which had once cataloged invitations and guests, now recorded audit procedures and donor constraints. It was a strange metamorphosis in my hands and a welcome one. The plant margin grew with a slow obstinacy, leaves unfurled with the patience of things that do not count headlines. I moved it to a larger pot and wrote in the ledger. Margin. Repotted, EO901. Growth 12% over last month. Notes. Resilience improving. The plant's health became a kind of barometer for what we aspired to. Care that is persistent, not futile. Margins that are cultivated and verifiable. People asked, sometimes with a whisper, whether my social life had changed. In a limited sense, it had. Some dinners felt differently charged. Acquaintances recalculated the currency of proximity. I learned to refuse gestures that sought to privatize my labor, as if it were a favor only I could exchange. I learned to hand the ledger to other hands. Harini to oversee archiving protocols. Rosa to manage operations. Ross to steward legal partnerships. Lena to hold the public narrative in a frame that favored systems over spectacle. The Foundation was not my vanity project. We designed it so that if I left tomorrow, the work would persist. Dante continued to be a figure of tension. He participated in audits, funded remediation under the oversight rules, and accepted that he would not be the arbiter of the story's end. He was not exiled from our orbit. Remediation often requires proximity to the harm source to be effective. He also agreed to be monitored. Audits would be published, and any funds he provided would be traceable. The ledger contains the kind of compromise that is neither absolution nor enmity. It is the infrastructure of accountability. There were days when the work exhausted me. There were passages when the ledger felt like a map of grief and brickwork at the same time. I learned to set small boundaries that were enforceable. The Foundation's intake had a maximum eligibility for emergency grants, a triage that meant a simple request could be fulfilled without a months-long legal fight. That triage was life-saving for someone whose livelihood would be destroyed by the mere circulation of an image. We learned to act quickly where preservation could be secured, and to be patient where law required it. Ella, who had been reluctant at first to take the spotlight, began to speak quietly at advisory meetings about the everyday logistics of being centered in an exposure economy. how job applications became conversations about an image, how the cost of reputation management is not only monetary but temporal, how the exhaustion of defending oneself felt like a permanent tax. She advocated for intake protocols that minimized re-traumatization and for an option to have matched pro bono counsel assigned swiftly. Justice for us, she said, is the ability to work without the anxiety of being monetized for someone else's attention. One of the Foundation's early measurable impacts arrived in a way that felt like a small miracle of procedure. A platform's pilot program accepted a preservation request for a case that was not mine. The program placed a legal hold while counsel reviewed the content. That hold allowed a local counsel to access invoices that proved a vendor had been hired repeatedly by the same firm to monitor a cluster of properties. Those invoices, once in hand, allowed for a civil suit that produced a settlement allocating funds to a victim remedial program. Nothing about the settlement erased harm retroactively, but it created an acknowledgement within the market that exposure had costs beyond a monthly fee. We documented these outcomes meticulously. The ledger kept a quiet, unflashy record. Pilot success, 1011 preservation hold, invoices produced, civil suit filed, settlement allocated to margins remediation fund. The language is brusque because it is intended for auditing. It is also, in its own grueling way, a form of celebration. The Foundation's white paper remained a living document. We revised it to include best practices from the pilot, to refine intake forms to be less demand-heavy, and to propose statutory language for preservation requests that would reduce ambiguity. The document recommended that platforms implement a standard form for emergency preservation, one that would be machine-readable, time-stamped, and routed to an independent archivist when urgent. It also suggested that reputation firms be required to publish retention windows and client identities when subpoenaed in cases of alleged exploitation. None of these policy shifts fixed everything. The market for attention is not an organism that yields easily to regulation. Some vendors adapted in cosmetic ways. Some continued to operate in jurisdictions that made enforcement difficult. But the ledger and the Foundation provided a collective weight that individual grievance could not. We were not only preserving files, we were preserving the means by which a person could prove harm. There were nights when I sat with the ledger and the brass key under the greenhouse light and allowed myself to feel a small, guarded peace. Not the ecstatic, unqualified peace that fiction sometimes bestows, the kind that suggests the problem has been solved, and one needs merely to close a door. Not a naive peace that imagines a market can be entirely neutered. Rather, a peace that is auditable, margins that can be measured, protocols that can be tested, a council that can be convened, funds that are traceable, and an intention that is publicly accountable. At the Foundation's first public event, an understated gathering meant less for spectacle than for the convening of survivors, technologists, and policymakers. Lena moderated a panel and invited a survivor to speak about the day a photograph changed the trajectory of her life. She spoke without sensational detail. The economic impact, the lost work, the shadow it cast. She spoke about the relief of being heard by a legal triage that treated preservation as an emergency, not as a luxury. Her voice was steady. Afterward, people approached quietly with the kind of awkward gratitude that recognizes the labor it takes to gather systems around pain. We published the audit of Dante's access with care for all involved. The report acknowledged his initiation of the viewport and the vendor's role in facilitating access, and it recommended oversight measures he accepted. It also recommended that the Foundation make clear its independence and the Survivor Advisory Council's authority to veto donors or remediation uses that might compromise its mission. The audit became a public document. It was not the end of the story for Dante or for us, but it was another ledger entry that made decisions legible. Months passed, and the small victories accumulated. Platforms published clearer preservation procedures. A couple of reputation firms updated their invoices to include explicit retention windows. The Foundation processed dozens of intake requests, prioritized preservation, and matched survivors with counsel. We published our white paper and sent it to lawmakers. Hearings were scheduled. The DA's investigations continued, and while they did not produce a sweeping criminal indictment, they did force vendors into disclosure and into the light of public scrutiny. The brass key remained in the dish. So did its sealed duplicate. I still placed my palm over the metal sometimes when decisions felt heavy. I would wait there, hands quiet, and imagine the plant margin growing toward a window where light was not merely spectacle but service. In small ways, plant growth, published audits, pilot preservation programs, our work had shifted the ecology. The ledger, which once measured parties and donors and the occasional gossip that flared around a season, had become a repository of procedures and promises. It was a moral instrument and a technical one. It demanded patience and care and constant revision. The work might be messy and partial, I had written in the early days, and indeed it was. But the messiness was a feature of realistic change, not a bug. There is a phrase people sometimes use about justice. It is not a state, but a practice. If that is true, then peace, too, is a practice. For me, peace meant having a margin that was not simply purchased and hidden, but constructed and certified by people who were accountable. It meant that when a viewport was initiated at 0213, there would be a chain that could be followed, witnesses that could be called, and an institution that could be asked to act. It meant advocacy beyond the personal, a public ledger that did not leave the poor to gather proof from rumors. On a late autumn night after a meeting where the advisory council debated intake thresholds, I found myself in the greenhouse watering margin. The light caught the water and the leaves and made small, exact reflections. Rosa had left a small dish of keys beside the ledger, as if to remind us of the balance between trust and custody. I placed both brass keys in the dish, Dante's Our Copy, side by side. I did not lock them away in theater. I set them where anyone entering the house would see them, and perhaps wonder at the small liturgy. 2 keys, 1 dish, 2 roles. Access and custodianship. There will be more ledger entries. There will be vendor evasions and platform delays and legislators who misunderstand the nuance of preservation law. There will be survivors we cannot save and survivors we will help. There will be donors who push for publicity and others who prefer to be anonymous. The structure we built must always resist the capture of private grief into public spectacle. The work will be slow and small and cumulative. In the quiet that followed, with the greenhouse light warm on my hands and the ledger closed beside me, I let the notion of peace be something I could measure. Not the untroubled sleep that stories sometimes promise, but a practiced margin. Protocols, preservation, public instruments, and a council that does not let a single person bear the burden of proof alone. If you have come this far and feel that this story speaks to you, there is a place to go that gathers resources, guidance, and, when available, emergency preservation assistance. Margin's site lays out intake procedures, survivor resources, and ways to support systemic work rather than private smoothing. If you believe private wrongs should not be erased by a check, if you believe that privacy must be auditable and accessible, consider learning more, sharing the resources, or supporting the work. I turned the brass key in the dish with a small, careful motion, and then set my hand on Margin's pot. The plant does not promise an end. It promises attention. The ledger does not guarantee vindication. It guarantees record. I had everything: the visibility, the rice paper invitations, the ledger of my social life. But peace was never part of the inventory until I made it one. The work of building auditable margins will outlast the seasons of scandal. It will be slow, and it will be procedural, and in that slow insistence I have found a peace I can measure and defend.